Hello and welcome to Monocle on Culture. I'm Robert Bound. A podcast about podcasts is the fairly meta offering on today's show. We'll be highlighting some of our other favourite audio productions and celebrating the medium we know and love, although, of course, as you know, we are a radio show. First, we'll mark the return of the hugely popular podcast Heavyweight with its voice and creator, Jonathan Goldstein. And then, friend of the show, Kate Hutchinson will be here to tell us all about her brand new project, Studio Radicals, a series that puts musicians, producers and engineers in the spotlight. Keep your ears pricked up then, because that is all ahead here on Monocle on Culture. Now, the depth and complexity of the storytelling at the heart of the podcast Heavyweight is difficult to explain without having heard an episode or two. The seemingly simple premise is that guests engage the help of presenter Jonathan Goldstein to reckon with some unsolved aspect of their past. They might be looking for an answer, a person, or a parrot. And that search may take Goldstein some Googling, some lengthy month-long email exchanges, or trips across the entire United States. Ultimately, guests tend to leave with questions answered, but often it's not the one that they started with. I was delighted to speak with Jonathan about the work that goes into making such a show, the dedication he has to the story, and what listeners can expect from upcoming episodes now that the podcast has a new home at Pushkin Industries. So, Jonathan, it's wonderful to speak to you about the return of Heavyweight, and congratulations on that. There's been obviously a bit of a hiatus, a lot of chat online about the joyful return of this obviously much loved piece of amazing long-form documentary journalism. I mean, like nothing else really online.
Thank you so much.
I wanted to ask you first, if there was a story, and maybe it wasn't Buzz, the first one that you ever put up on the Heavyweight stream, whether there was a story that convinced you that this was a going concern, that Heavyweight had legs.
There was a couple moments. I think like the first story I ever did that became a blueprint was a weekend where I went with my father, Buzz, who at the time was 80, to go visit his brother Sheldon, who at the time was 85, to spend a weekend together because they had not spoken in like over 40 years. And I had this fear that, you know, they would both have regrets if they didn't make amends. We went on a road trip, my father and I. We went down to Florida where Sheldon was living, and they kind of hashed it out over the course of a weekend, and I tried my best to sort of, you know, stay out of the way whenever I could. And then when it was necessary to come in, I was kind of like a rodeo clown, you know, to break up any, you know, possible fracas. And yeah, so that made me feel like maybe this thing can have a life, like where this sort of thing happens with other people. And that first season, it was all with friends and family, you know, people who I'd been hearing from how they've had like either beef with somebody or it's just some outstanding problem. With the second season, you know, like I ran out of all the friends and family that I had that, you know, that I could help. And we opened up the gates to listeners. And with that, I was sort of perceived as this expert, you know, and I didn't really know what I was doing at all, but I had to kind of step it up and be that thing and, you know, don that mantle in a way. And it changed the dynamic because the first season I was doing with people that I knew very well and you know, loved. And in the second season, doing it with strangers, the process became one in which I got to know them through the course of the episode and began to care about them. So that was cool too. And they were putting such trust in me that I felt like I really, you know, I had to honor it.
Yeah, there's some responsibility there when you're speaking with your friends and family in that first season. And there is a very slightly different tone to some of that stuff. But I think one of the reasons I've loved this show is that there is such a consistency and constancy of your tone of inquiry, the way you are with people. And that obviously has people trust you. It enables people to tell you and us their unbelievable stories, the unbelievable truth, as it were, right? Do you know of your technique as a journalist, as an emotional support person sometimes? Or does each episode and does your inquiry with each individual set of people pan out differently, I wonder, Jonathan?
Yeah, I think it's always quite different. Initially, the great change was going from friends and family to strangers. There was a level, I think usually once I'm comfortable, they could become, or comfortably uncomfortable in a way. Like they could kind of, I could help them to become more comfortable too. And with friends and family, I had a level of comfort and I felt like I could kind of nudge them. And in doing the same kind of work with strangers, I felt like I had to get to that place. And it usually began with helping myself to get a little more comfortable and kind of embracing the awkwardness and seeing the awkwardness as a step along the way to talking about difficult things and gaining truth, I guess. And sometimes my presence became a focal point for the two of them to bond about, like, even if it was at my expense, you know?
There is a lot of talk online about the kind of editorial flight paths that each story takes. I mean, if we were to draw kind of one of these kind of murder maps on a wall of where you go, the phone calls you make, the internet searches you make, traversing the states, it's an incredible thing. I wonder has there been a show that was the most convoluted to put together? And I wonder if it did it offer the greatest reward in its final getting across the line?
Yes. The one that comes immediately to mind, and I should say that I get a lot of help. I mean, like, from my producers, from Stevie Lane and Kalila Holt. I mean, they're dogged. We could spend over a year trying to track someone or something down. There was one episode where this guy named Scott, he became a drug addict as a young person, and he ended up selling off. He would, steal stuff from his dad and sell it off. And one of the things that he sold off was this family heirloom. It was a gun that his grandfather had taken from a Nazi officer in World War II. And finding that gun was nearly impossible. Like, it was a lot. Sometimes it's just a lot of luck. We went through, pawn shops and gun shows and like all kinds of craziness to try to find this gun. And when we finally found it, the irony is that the object itself has to somehow transcend and become like a stand-in for, I guess, an idea. Because when Scott finally presented the gun to his father, the father was, thankful, but like he kind of just chucked the gun aside. And it was clear that the gun did not represent to the father what it represented for Scott, and that ultimately the father was just so happy that he had his son back, that his son had overcome his addiction, and he didn't care quite as much about the gun as Scott cared about it. And it allowed for them to have, for the first time, a very difficult conversation where the father was able to talk about his fear of losing his son and what that was like, what he went through as a parent. And so the gun became a conduit for this conversation. And I think that's sometimes the tricky thing. Like, you'll spend a lot of time trying to get this object, but then in the end, it's just an object unless the conversation takes place around it.
It's a very intimate program, necessarily. I mean, we start off, I'd like to ask you about this specifically, but we often start off with the trilling of a phone call, which is you making your maybe first inquiry into these people's lives or whatever. And then intimacy happens very quickly. We're listening in on people's phone conversations. Yeah. There's tears, there's laughter, there's the uncovering of amazing family truths and stuff like this. Do people retain their emotional dependence upon you, Jonathan, if indeed they do? I mean, they do for the auspices of the series, but I bet that is difficult for them and perhaps for you to shake. I wonder how that shakes down.
It is not a typical, interviewee relationship. Like, when we say goodbye, I won't be like, well, wait a minute, Where, what? I thought we were friends. No.
I'm very saddened by that. Maybe one day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel open, I feel open. I feel like the door is open, and I will sometimes hear from people and I feel like a special bond with them. There was a guy who recently reached out. He was in the episode called Jesse, where he was hit by a driver. He was on a bicycle. The driver hit him, and he always wondered about this driver because his life was changed after this accident, and the physical disabilities that were visited upon him because of this accident changed his personality in ways that he felt were for the better, which was a striking thing and really hard for me to wrap my head around. But he convinced me that it was so. And he comes to mind because he just reached out and he felt like, I feel like I can ask you a favor, is the way that he put it. And I felt like, yeah, you can. And there was, something that he wanted me to do. And I felt like I was glad to be able to reciprocate. And it feels like life. It feels like an experience, I think, like that transcends just the episode.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it does for listeners. I mean, it does for me. You don't stop thinking about these stories. And I think you can go back to these stories, like a good short story that give you nourishment, spiritual nourishment. These things are incredible slices of life, whether they're true or not. And that the fact that they are true maybe makes it easier for everyone to look the world in the eye that much more boldly, perhaps. I wondered if people contact you, obviously since season 2, it's been a kind of listener-generated inquiry system. Obviously, you're looking for stories that could be great, that clearly have to have some sense of being achievable. And then I wonder if you're looking for a kind of tone of voice of people, not necessarily their voices itself. You don't want just flat-out narcissists phoning up going, make my problems go away, Jonathan. There's obviously some casting that goes on, but it appears to be exceptionally subtle.
Yeah, it's an interesting balance because like sometimes some will have a little bit of a performer instinct in them, and that's sometimes useful. It's, not a bad thing. Certainly like the medium of audio is, that doesn't quite project its broadcastiness as television, allows for people to kind of be a little less self-conscious, I hope, and it's one of the things I really like about audio. But, sometimes it's funny. Like sometimes people will. One of the things that I had to deal with was by the second season, like it was like people who were listeners of the show and knew me as the guy on the podcast, and that would make them a little, self-conscious or nervous initially. But what usually happens is, like, honestly, about 15 minutes into the conversation, I'm just a guy talking to them, and all the other stuff kind of like just recedes. So it's helpful that like people know the show, so they know what they're getting into and they know the kinds of things that we're looking for. So that's good. But then ultimately you want people to just be themselves and feel free, and not feel like they need to produce themselves. They can allow us to do that.
Heavyweight's intimacy is such a strong point of it. It's very tender. It's great to listen to on earphones. And I wondered, what if you listened to kind of late night radio when you were a kid, Jonathan? It feels like it's got a kind of, when lonely people would call in and tell the DJ their problems and ask them to play them a record. I'm reminded of Donald Fagen's Nightfly or something. The album cover to that. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. People phoning in. And I wondered if you listened to any of that stuff growing up to kind of get such a great feel for or love of this intimacy.
We weren't really like a big radio household. I do remember I had a girlfriend when I was in my early 20s who used to love listening to Larry King when he was, before he was on TV, when he was still just on the radio before going to bed and when she had insomnia. And there is something kind of cozy and comforting about that kind of presence. And I became a radio person when I started working for This American Life, I have to say. Like, that was when the I was all in. But I loved listening to. Have you ever heard of Joe Frank? I've got a poster of him on the wall there.
Oh, yeah.
You could see. I discovered him while at This American Life through Ira Glass, because Ira had, I think, gotten I think it was his first radio job was working for Joe Frank. And Joe Frank's really, I recommend him. He's really got that late night, it would play on KCRW in California like late at night, and he's got a beautiful voice, and it had a lot of atmosphere and mood about it. And that's something that audio is able to do very well. And he would use that kind of cinematic music that This American Life picked up on and ran with. And he's sort of like, my biggest influences are like him and Ira. Ira went in one direction, like it's a vision of radio that's very kind of that he would describe as didactic, where it's like you tell people what you're going to play them, you play it, and then you kind of tell them what to make of it. You bring ideas to bear. And Joe Frank's stuff was that late night vibe kind of stuff you're talking about, where he would just do these monologues and telephone conversations, and you were just dropped into it, and you didn't quite know where you were, but there was something compelling about it and atmospheric.
Yeah, I shall check that out. It sounds like it sounds amazing. I don't want to go without giving my, and I'm sure many of our listeners, love to Jackie. Will we hear more of Jackie at your new home under Pushkin Industries?
It's always, really just, it's crazy to think that, I'm an adult who is running kind of like a business in a sense. I mean, it's a show that I can't really know. I don't know if she's going to pick up the phone. It seems like a really bad business model to have a partner who you don't know if they're going to answer the phone from season to season. And I talked about it with her. She lives in Montreal. That's where I grew up. And we were with a whole group of our friends, and they were like, yeah, why don't you just pick up the phone? Why are you giving him such a hard time? We were kind of ganging up on her a little bit. And I don't know, she's just set in her ways. She's a serious person. She's like a doctor. She does serious work, and I'm calling her up to do this kind of, kid-like buffoonery that, I don't know, I would think is a nice break from her serious doctoring, but she doesn't always feel that way. So I don't know. I hope so.
She's another very strong part of the program. Well, Jonathan, good luck with the next season under the new banner at Pushkin of Heavyweight.
Thank
I'm
you.
sure I am just one of many, many millions. I'm looking forward to the next amazing stories that you're going to tell us. So thank you very much.
Oh, that's very kind. Thank you.
That was Jonathan Goldstein, and Heavyweight returns on the 12th of May with a check-in from the team. And listen out for more episodes that are following in the year. Finally, on today's show, Studio Radicals is a new podcast offering in-depth interviews and insights from the music industry's professionals and creatives. From making to mixing and recording music, the podcast brings together visionaries with a distinctive approach in the studio that focuses on the producers of the records, but also includes the artists to shed light on how the vibe was arrived at for a particular record. The host, Kate Hutchinson, travelled to studios and mixing desks across the UK, Europe and across the Atlantic to speak to innovative creatives about their craft and skill and what it takes to be a radical in the music industry. From the sunny delights of California, then, to the irresistible allure of Abbey Road studios, each episode is audio gold. I sat down with Kate in our studios here at Midori House, and I asked her first about her intention for the scope of the series.
We really wanted to focus on the people that we thought were doing something different in the studio, who had a really interesting approach to sound, who are really pushing the boundaries, and who have a beautiful way of talking about music and the kind of, the dark art, the magic of working with artists in the studio. And there's also artists in the studio themselves. We've got Suzanne Charney, who produces her own music live on stage, where the stage is her studio. So there's a real sort of breadth, I hope, of people in there They just all happened to be women for this series. And I travelled from Abbey Road Studios in London, where I met the wonderful mastering engineer Cicely Bolston, all the way to the sun-dappled coast of California at Suzanne Charney's place, which, as you can imagine, was terrible, with its beautiful view overlooking the bay and her wonderful sort of living room studio with her boucle and her piano set up, her analog synthesizer. That's the boucle that she uses to pioneer electronic music, as she did in the 70s. And then we've got mix engineers in Miami, Maria Elisa Yerbe. We've got leading producers like Catherine Marks, Grammy-winning producers like Catherine Marks, I should say, and Mercury-winning producers like Marta Sologni in East London. So, I went all over, really.
You really did. I mean, it's an amazing thing. And the geography is not just a nicety. And the way that you describe the studios that you visit and the working processes that you witness here and in the series, Kate, are really important, because the studio, the geography, the topography, what you see out the window, and how the interplay of all these things and the air in the room itself, these are all kind of parts of the musical instrument that is the studio, right? And this is what you're delving down into with this series, is the confluence of influences, I suppose, that make this amazing sound that these people make.
Oh, totally. And look, I just love going into people's spaces and see how they design them and getting to look at all their stuff. Marta Sologni's space in East London is a bit like an extension of her living room. She's got all these records and all these books, and she describes it, she calls it Studio Owner. She describes herself as a sort of guide. You come into her studio and, she can take you around maybe the tape machines over there, maybe the bookcase over there, and pull out some inspiration. I love this idea that if you're an artist, especially one that's sort of on the up, maybe you're making your debut album together and it might be one of your first times in the studio and kind of getting to explore making music in this way. And then, you're looking at all of Marta's things and perhaps finding some inspiration in a photography book or, in her jazz records section. So I feel like the studio is a really personal space, and it can be. I mean, obviously people do sort of parachute into different studios around the world to team up with artists, and that's interesting in its own way too. Kind of, how do you make that your own and get to grips with the sort of, the control station and turn out something brilliant? And we hear those stories too. But I do love it when we get to go into people's more intimate spaces in their houses. Hannah Peel's another example of that. Yeah. Up in Yorkshire, she's got this great studio in this cottage above her living space. And it's just such a gorgeous, warm, cosy space. And she makes brilliant soundtracks there. So it's really interesting just to get to be nosy, basically.
It is. This is one of the great facets of our jobs, isn't it? This is when we're lucky as writers and reporters and the makers of podcasts, is that we get to go into these places and we get the open door policy and we can nose around in people's record collections and books of photography, etc., etc. It's wonderful. And it's wonderful. And you are such a good interviewer, Kate. You really kind of lift the lid on people's creative processes, which is much less easy to do than people perhaps think it is. And to have people talk about their creative processes in such a beguiling way. And you mentioned Marta Sologni, who's the star of episode 1. And she's amazing. I mean, also, we should say that a lot of your interlocutors have beautiful voices. And we're all quite close to the mic, and it's very beautiful. By the way, no pressure, making a podcast all about beautiful sound and texture and all the rest of it. Should we mention?
Yeah, I have to say, it was incredibly edited and put together by Holly Fisher, who has been a long-standing, a former employee of Monocle Radio, and who I met here, actually, on your culture show. So it's been really wonderful to work with her. But yeah, no pressure. I think she's been really sort of, the beads of sweat rolling down her face as she's sort of, making all the levels and everything sound as great as it can. But the sound design's so great. It's brilliant that you mention Marta. I think she's got I think often when we think about certainly the technical aspects of music making, production, engineering, mixing, recording, that sort of thing, rather than being the kind of artist, you don't necessarily tend to think about it in artistic terms. It's very technical. There's a lot of wizardry that goes on. There's a lot of moving the dials and sort of moving waveforms and those kinds of things that we might associate have been with previously as being kind of quite nerdy.
This is why this series comes alive, because you have people, you get the best out of people. People are obviously very willing and happy to talk about their creative process and how they put these sounds together. And I wondered if you got the impression that, and I know that Marta Sologni, she's worked with Sampha, Björk, Depeche Mode, so quite a range of different artists that have a different sound world. She's got a lot of different kind of paints in her palette. But did you get the feeling that she talks to the artists that she works with in terms of sounds themselves? Do you want a bit more? Do you want a bit more? Or is it a linguistic process to describe the sounds? Because that's always, I wonder what stuff can get lost on the cutting room floor if you're trying to talk in words about something that isn't words.
Definitely. I think she's got a very special skill at translating imagery into sound and feelings into sound. I think all of the producers and engineers and people that we spoke to do have a really sort of special, I mean, this is why they're radical, right? I think they've got a really special knack of translating what the artist is, maybe even what the artist is feeling on that day. I mean, Romera Abraham, she's a vocal engineer. She comes later in the series. She's fantastic, and she talks about how an artist will come into the studio with her, and she kind of has to tap in to what zone, what energy they're feeling in that moment and figure out how to get that into the vocal and out into the recording. And I think that's such a wonderful, special skill to be able to have. And like I said, it's what makes these individuals so radical.
I got the sense that you kind of get into the spiritual realm quite quickly with these interviews and with your subjects. In a really good way.
Yeah, we light an incense stick before each interview, and
we light up
a
something.
Crystal.
Yeah, I mean, it really is great. And there's obviously a great thing, because for people to lose whatever armour they might have had to begin with is a great skill. But it's really wonderful to really get into the bones of the sounds and the reasons they exist and the ways that they were made. It's really, really brilliant. And then to capture it, and I listen to it. I happen to listen to it in my earphones rather than on a loudspeaker. But however you choose to do it, it does sound great. But yes, am I right to say that you lent into the spiritual aspect of the music, Kate?
I can't help but lean into the spiritual aspect. I think that it's a tricky thing and it's a challenge to make podcasts and interviews about music, translate and maybe connect with a wider audience, or connect on a different level or a deeper level with people. And I think that's what I'm always looking for. And certainly DCS Audio, who I co-produce the podcast with, I think we're looking for ways to really kind of connect on a deeper level. And often that does mean kind of going into other realms, drilling in a little bit deeper into areas that maybe people haven't necessarily thought of or aren't used to maybe thinking about their art in that way. And I think there's a whole spectrum of that. But then there's also, like Catherine Marks says, she is kind of looking at that sort of, more spiritual, sort of deeper emotional resonance, but she also just wants to make a banging record.
And did you get a sense of these amazing producers and engineers? Did you get a sense of their formative musical experiences? The kind of, Marta's great when she talks about walking into a recording studio. I think she kind of snuck in when the door was closing behind someone with a larger name back in the day, and sat in front of the mixing desk and sort of said, I sort of fell in love at first sight. I look at a mixing desk and I think there's 26,000 buttons on it. What goes where? But there were formative moments in people's career when they kind of became that producer, but also formative moments being in the car with their parents and the tapes that might have been on, or the radio stations playing. Because these all are so important to our musical DNA, aren't they?
Oh, totally. I think there's a range of stories like that, but it's funny when you mentioned that story about Marta seeing a mixing console for the first time, because it also sort of reflected what Suzanne Charney said about seeing a Buchla analog synthesizer in the 70s for the first time. And I get this sense that to these people, this technology offered freedom. It was like seeing a portal, not to get too woo-woo, but, there I go again, getting all woo-woo. But it's like a portal to freedom, I think.
Do you mean as opposed to a musical instrument, a guitar, a piano, which you might have had to have been the singer-songwriter, the star, in order to be able to learn how to play that?
Totally. And I also think it lends itself to, you said we see one of these boxes and we think it sees all these dials. But for a lot of people, some people, those particular kind of radical minds, they might see a sort of opportunity in which to manipulate sound. I don't know, I just really get this sense of like Studio Radicals hopefully is this testament to experimentation.
It's absolutely wonderful stuff. I mean, the series, you're such good company for the whole series. Your subjects are wonderful. You get such good stuff out of them. It is still underexplored territory, despite some of the records that these people have worked on. It's fascinating stuff. You're really digging a fresh field with this stuff. It's really, really lovely. And it sounds great too, very importantly. Congratulations, Kate Hutchinson, on the new podcast series, which is called Studio Radicals. And thank you.
Thank you, Robert.
Kate Hutchinson there, and Studio Radicals launches on the 23rd of April. And that is all for this week. My thanks to Kate and Jonathan. And Monocle on Culture is produced by Sophie Monaghan-Coombs and Steph Chungu, and Steph also edits the show. We'll be back at the same time next week, but until then, from me, Robert Bound, thanks for tuning in.